There is a cabinet in the south gallery that smells faintly of cinnamon, lamp oil, and old scorched brass. I do not recommend opening it casually. Its drawers hold seals from vanished custom houses, harbour tallies written on parchment thin as onion skin, fragments of trade compacts that outlived the merchants who signed them, and sand, so much sand. Sand in the hinges, sand in the vellum, sand trapped beneath lacquer, sand lodged in the carved grooves of little ivory tokens once used to count births, tariffs, slave lots, spice consignments, and naval obligations. One can sweep the cabinet, empty it, polish it, lock it, move it to another room, and still, some days later, discover a line of pale grit lying across the shelf like a small frontier that has no intention of respecting the archivist. South Country history does that. It enters the archive and declines to remain where it was assigned. Welcome back to the Hidden Stacks. I am Aurelian Cantonine, Baelnorn Law Warden, keeper of old roads, old courts, old coastlines, and the less flattering truths empires prefer to bury beneath ceremonial stone. This is The Lich's Tale, a Faerûn Lorecast. We are deep now into our second season, Realms Between Ruins, the Long Age of Kingdoms. In the first season, we crossed the vast sweep, the contradictory dawn stories, the creator races, tearfall and remade geography, the old contests of dragons and giants, the first flowering of the elves, the crown wars and the making of Drow, the founding time, dwarven realms under stone, Imaskar and stolen peoples, Netheril, Myth Drana, factions that outlived states, gods falling in the time of troubles, the spell plague, the second sundering, and the breathing space of the present age. We asked how Faerûn became Faerûn. This season asks who inherited it. We began by refusing the fantasy of empty land. We looked upon the world after catastrophe and said, no, these later realms are not first builders. They are heirs, scavengers, interpreters, trespassers, restorers, deniers, and opportunists. After Empire, the stones remain, roads remain, wards remain, claims remain, grievances remain, ghosts in some regions remain with admirable administrative discipline. Then we turn to Jamdath, where disciplined thought itself became a civic instrument, where psionic cultivation shaped law, war, education, rank, and the self-image of an empire that believed the trained mind could order the world more cleanly than coarser forms of power. After that came Mulhorand and Unther, where the Mulan inheritance became not merely memory of theft and liberation, but the foundation of divine states. Temple bureaucracy, god kingship, sacred labor, ritual law, and the enormous durability that can arise when administration learns to speak in the voice of heaven. Last time, we remained among waters shaped by old conflict and studied Chesenta, Chondath, and the Vilhon Reach, where inland sea politics made merchants into admirals, soldiers into citizens, and civic pride into something dangerously close to military doctrine. We saw that trade and violence are often not opposites at all. In some regions they are colleagues. In well-dressed regions they are introduced as cousins. Tonight we go south, far south by northern standards. South enough that many tavern maps begin to simplify. South enough that northern chroniclers, when they are at their laziest, begin speaking in fabrics, perfumes and heat, as if climate were analysis and spice were political theory. South enough that some listeners, if poorly taught, may imagine an exotic margin. It is not a margin. Calimshan is one of Faerûn's great continuities. Old not in the decorative sense. Not old because someone carved a few weathered lintels and wrote a poem about antiquity. Old because conquest, plague, fire, cult, dynasty, rebellion, trade, divine fashion, imperial ambition, and social cruelty have all passed through it without succeeding in making it truly young again. Old because its capital, Kalimport, has been destroyed and rebuilt so often that destruction itself became part of the city's architectural method. Old because the land still bears the scars of Genie War, and the people, even when they deny the old bargains, speak within institutions shaped by them. Tonight's thesis is this. Calimshan is one of Faerûn's clearest examples of deep-time urban continuity, where conquest changes the regime more easily than it changes the civilization. To speak of Calimshan properly, one must resist two temptations. The first is romanticism. Silk is not innocence. Minarets do not absolve slavery. Perfume does not soften coercion. A city may be beautiful and cruel at once. In truth, many old cities are most beautiful where their cruelties have been made profitable enough to fund ornament. The second temptation is condescension. The South is not decadent merely because it is old, wealthy, ceremonious, or more comfortable with layered sophistication than some drafty northern fort whose principal cultural achievement is producing excellent wool and an annual riot. Calimshan is not a cautionary fable about softness. It is a civilization, and civilizations must be studied whole. This episode is brought to you by Dharma Web Solutions. If you require a site, platform, or digital structure built with actual respect for maintenance, clarity, and the unpleasant but necessary reality that people will have to live inside the systems you create, visit dharmawebsolutions.com. A good harbor is not merely attractive from the cliffs. It must bear weight, traffic, weather, and human misuse. So must a good website. So must a state, though states are lamentably less likely to ask for competent developers before launch. Now then, picture the southwestern corner of Faerûn not as an empty blaze of yellow on a broad map, but as an argument among sea, desert, mountains, memory, and trade. The shining sea lies to the south, wide and rich with roots. To the north and northeast stand mountain chains and uplands that both protect and confine. The marching mountains, the Alamir heights, older ranges and older stone define corridors, choke points and weather. Inland, the Kalim Desert broods where once there were other lands. To one side lurks the spider swamp, itself a memory of catastrophe hardened into geography. Along the coast and river mouths arise cities, estates, villages, fortifications, caravan stations, gardens wherever water can be mastered, and ports whose fortunes depend not on one kingdom alone, but on the traffic of the wider sea. This matters, my apprentice, because geography is the first constitution. A people living upon such ground must become interpreters of passage. They learn harbours, wells, caravan rhythms, oasis chains, prevailing winds, tax choke points, and the difference between a road that enriches a city and a road that exposes it. They learn how far grain can be moved before spoilage, how much force a port must maintain to keep piracy from becoming policy, how many insults a noble house may exchange with a guild before commerce begins to retaliate with numbers rather than swords. If you live long enough in such a region, you stop thinking of land and sea as separate domains. They become one economic organism. That is one reason Calimshan endured. Another is simpler. Great cities survive because too many people need them to survive. Not out of affection, out of dependence. But I move ahead of myself. Before Calimshan became Calimshan, before Calimport became the sprawling, layered, dangerous marvel later travelers knew, the region was not empty. Nothing in Faerûn worth fighting over is ever truly empty. Ancient forests spread where later cities would rise. Keltormir lay over much of the land in ages so old that later political borders become embarrassing little scratches by comparison. Elves moved there, giants contested there. Dwarves delved in nearby ranges and underlands in kingdoms older than many human memories can comfortably hold. Primitive humans came and went in scattered communities. The land already possessed prior meanings before any later chronicler found a convenient year from which to begin counting. Remember that. It will save you from the vulgar habit of believing that history begins when a literate conqueror finally notices a place. Then came the great arrival of Calim. Around the 8th millennium before Dale Reckoning, according to the strongest southern traditions, the noble Jinni Lord Calim entered Faerûn in the region around what would later become Calimport. He did not come alone. He came with genies, followers, servants, and with human and halfling slaves collectively remembered in old accounts as the Gen. Here the first of Calimshan's great inherited shames must be spoken plainly. The civilization's deepest visible continuity does not begin with a free city, nor a proud compact of citizens, nor a wise senate, nor a pastoral tribe ripening naturally into polity. It begins in one of its foundational narratives with forced labor under extraplanar command. Do not look away from that, because later architecture is handsome. Calim's regime was not merely a settlement, it was an imposition on land, peoples, and scale. The city that became Calimport was built rapidly, its foundations laid by beings acting under the will of a genie lord who treated planning and conquest as related arts. This is an important nuance. Calim, in the old tales, is not remembered merely as a brute of wind and command. He is remembered as a strategist, a maker, almost an aesthete of rule. To him, a city was a design and a battle plan, another kind of design. That sort of mind can be efficient. It can also become monstrous with unusual elegance. Within months, other settlements followed. The Calim Empire, sometimes remembered as the Calim Caliphates, extended itself through the region with startling speed. Forests were felled, giants and dragons were driven out or fought. Cities were planted like declarations. For listeners trained by northern histories, it is worth pausing here. We are not yet in the age of Netherese enclaves, not in the old god-king orders of the East, not in the later feudal and mercantile states familiar to many adventurers. Yet here, already, is a large-scale human civilization in the south, shaped by non-human masters, dependent on slavery and thinking in terms of imperial design. South Country antiquity does not wait politely for northern recognition. The city later generations would call Calimport was from the beginning a port and administrative heart, but never merely that. It was a performance of centrality. Ports often are. They do not only receive goods, they proclaim that the world's motion has reasons, and that those reasons now stop here to pay the proper fees. In a place like Calimport, The harbour, palace, counting house, barracks, market, temple district, and noble residence are not accidental neighbours. They are a theory of civilization made stone. And what a theory it was. A harbour city at the meeting of sea traffic and inland command can become many things. A customs gate, a treasure vault, a military hinge, a cultural blender, a slave market, a refuge for the ambitious, a trap for the poor, and a mirror in which an empire studies its own face. Calimport, almost from the first, tended toward all of these at once. You may ask whether the earliest city already possessed the later Calishite complexity of pashas, guilds, layered districts, merchant factions, and the maddeningly elaborate etiquette of titles that later made polite introduction in Calimport feel like military drill conducted by poets. No, not yet. But the habit of scale was there. And scale, once normalized, leaves descendants. The early centuries of Kalim's dominion were not peaceful. The old stories are full of violence, but notice the pattern. Each violence leaves an institution, a scar, or a geography behind it. That is the kind of history we are tracing tonight. Not long after Calimport's founding, dragons struck. One tradition places the great burning of the city scarcely a decade into its history, as worms descended and sacked the new capital. A younger or weaker city might have vanished into legend there. Calimport did not. Genie power rebuilt it. This is your first lesson in Calishite continuity. Destruction was never treated only as ending. It was treated as interruption. The city would be made again. The counterstroke mattered as well. Calim's retaliation against draconic powers in the Marching Mountains and beyond helped define southern memory for millennia. Later, chroniclers would say that dragon power in those mountains remained broken for ages. Whether every tale of total extermination is soberly exact is less important than the cultural conclusion people drew. The South remembered that titanic conflict could be answered with equal titanic force, and that landscape itself could be disciplined by overwhelming will. This is not a gentle beginning for a civilization. But then enduring civilizations rarely begin gently. They begin with an ability to make hardship, coercion, and ambition look normal long enough for later generations to inherit them as custom. There were other genies, other rival powers, and eventually other fractures. Some among the genie nobility defected, founded their own domains, or pursued their own ambitions. One of the most destructive such conflicts, remembered in southern accounts as part of the steam clashes, involved the Marid Lord Ajhu and the city of Ajhutal. Here again, the point is not merely that there was a war. Of course there was a war. The point is what the war did to the map. In seeking to break a rival beyond negotiation, Calim employed magic so catastrophic that entire stretches of his own realm were mangled with the enemies. The destruction associated with the fall of Ajhutal helped create enduring changes in the land, among them the region later called the Spider Swamp and the reshaping of nearby waters. Pause on that. A ruler's quarrel with an insubordinate subordinate becomes, centuries later, a swamp, a shipping complication, a disease zone, a boundary condition for whole later states, and a permanent entry in regional memory. This is why I say the map is an archive. Each marsh can be an argument no one successfully ended. Now we come to Memnon. Several centuries after Kalim's arrival, the Ifriti lord Memnon entered Faerûn and founded his own realm to the north of Kalim's. If Kalim's order drew upon wind, sky, and the imperious artistry of a Jinni ruler, Memnon's bore the harder grammar of fire, forge, and uncompromising assertion. It is tempting to reduce the struggle between Calim and Memnon to elemental symbolism, wind versus flame, air versus fire, a myth fit to decorate a palace dome. Resist that temptation. The war mattered because two immense systems of enslaved labor, extraplanar command, military force, and territorial ambition now faced one another across a landscape full of cities, roads, irrigation, and frightened subjects. When old chroniclers speak of the era of Skyfire, do not imagine a single glorious duel lasting centuries. Imagine instead repeated campaigns, razed settlements, fields burned, fortifications broken, command networks tested, and ordinary people living generation after generation in the shadow of powers vast enough to make weather into weaponry. Imagine a farmer trying to decide whether to plant near a route that might become an army's path. Imagine a dock laborer unloading cargo while rumors spread that the northern roads are ash again. Imagine a slave family who knows that whether the banner above them carries the prestige of Calim or the furnace pride of Memnon, the lash is still a language they understand all too well. This is where we must begin speaking of daily life under very old power. Many histories fail here. They record rulers and catastrophes, then step daintily past the people whose backs paid for both. I will not make that omission. In the Calim and Memnon era, the ordinary experience of civilization was likely an experience of command. Labor was directed from above, with inhuman certainty. Cities were designed at a scale that required massive coordinated effort. Armies moved with support systems. Elite beings contended, but their contentions were translated into quotas, hauling, digging, provisioning, fortification, punishment, and service. Even magnificence has supply lines. What does a slave-built city feel like from within? It feels different depending on where one stands. To the lord, symmetry, resource, triumph, a harbor aligned with desire. To the overseer, inventory, timetables, corrective violence, the anxiety of being too low to enjoy splendor and too high to escape its moral corrosion. To the merchant with privileged access, opportunity. To the priest hoping to sacralize the existing order, revelation conveniently organized around those already in power. To the artisan, skill under demand. To the enslaved, the city is both prison and world, both machine and livelihood, a place where one survives by learning corners, routines, moods, chances for concealment, lines of patronage, and the difference between spectacle intended to dazzle and spectacle intended to intimidate. These patterns outlast rulers. Remember that as we continue, because one of the most important truths about Calimshan is that forms of domination can survive even when their original masters are gone. A society need not retain the same ruler to retain the habits that ruler normalized. The wars of Calim and Memnon stretched on for centuries. Cities were destroyed, farmland was ravaged, landscapes changed. Whole regions learned to think of devastation not as interruption, but as climate. And in the end, neither Genie Lord truly mastered the other. Their struggle became so destructive that outside intervention in the form of elven high magic ended it in the way so many ancient Faerûnian conflicts were ended. Not with tidy diplomacy, but with power of a different order imposed from beyond the quarrel's own moral imagination. At the battle on the Teshilal fields, the elven high mage Pharos and his allies employed high magic to disembody both Calim and Memnon, binding their consciousnesses apart from their bodies and trapping their physical essences with many other genies within the great artifact later known as the Calimemnon crystal. Southern memory never forgot this, though Southern opinion on it varied. Some saw it as merciful intervention. Others saw it as foreign correction imposed upon a region too weak to end its own disaster. Both readings have merit. Wisdom and humiliation are not mutually exclusive experiences. The binding of Calim and Memnon did not restore the land to health. Such neat repairs belong mostly to children, bards, and public officials giving speeches during reconstruction festivals. The disembodied struggle of the two imprisoned powers continued in altered form, and the very desert of Calim came to be understood as the result of their endless conflict. Calim's essence in air, Memnon's in the ground, their war made climate. Whether every grain of sand is literally attributable to that cosmic imprisonment is not the important question. The important question is what people believed the land meant. And in the south, the desert was no blank. It was memory-made weather. This is one reason Calimshan's later civilization developed such a particular relationship to environment. In many lands, sand is simply sand. In Calimshan, sand can be accusation, wind can be ancestry, fire can be politics. When a culture inherits a landscape believed to have been shaped by the passions of elemental lords, it does not easily separate meteorology from history. The desert is not an absence, it is a consequence. And there, beneath the magnificence and terror, is the hinge of the whole episode. Calim's empire falls, Memnon's realm falls. Yet the region does not become empty. The harbor remains useful. Roads remain imaginable. Populations remain present. Fields, though damaged, can be replanted. Ruined cities can be robbed, inhabited, rebuilt, or ritually cleansed and renamed. The civilization to come does not begin on untouched ground. It begins amid wreckage, precedent, and residual habits of scale. That is inheritance. And now we must ask the question that defines our entire season once again. When the great first masters go down, who takes possession of what they leave behind? The answer in the South is never singular. Human rebels mattered, dwarven powers mattered, surviving lesser genies mattered, local strongmen mattered, priests mattered, merchants mattered, the land's prior inhabitants and neighbors mattered. No civilization of this scale ever passes cleanly from one hand to another. However badly later dynasties may desire such a flattering genealogy. What the chronicles most often foreground is Coram the warrior and the founding of Calimshan after the last of the remaining genies were driven out. The very name deserves a pause. Calimshan, a successor realm forged from the broken remains of the old genie domains and human struggle beneath them. The founding traditions celebrate liberation, unification, and human rule. Very well, these are real elements, but any honest reading must add the harder truths beside them. Human rule after slavery is not automatically freedom for all. A people can overthrow foreign masters and keep the grammar of mastery. Indeed, that is one of history's favorite cruelties. The newly sovereign are often the quickest students of the old oppressor's methods, especially when those methods have already demonstrated their efficiency in building cities, disciplining labor, and extracting wealth. Calimshan's founding may be read as emancipation, but it may also be read as inheritance of apparatus. The whip changes hands, the port remains busy. This is where Calimshan becomes especially instructive for the realms as a whole. In many later kingdoms, ruins lie outside town. The older civilization is something one rides past on the way to market, or climbs into with a torch and a hireling before returning to ordinary life by sunset. In Calimshan, the old civilization remained inside ordinary life. The new state rebuilt Kalimport rather than abandoning the site. It drew on old roots, old foundations, old strategic logic, old concentrations of population and wealth. The southern pattern was not amnesia, it was accumulation. Calimshan endured for millennia, expanding and contracting, adjusting to rivals, internal tensions, and the realities of trade between north and south. It is easy to miss how important that is. A state need not be continuously glorious to be historically formative. Sometimes persistence is the greater achievement. Dynasties rise, borders shift, plagues come. Yet if the customs houses continue counting, if the port continues receiving, if the language of titles and ranks continues adapting, if old merchant families keep surviving by marrying, bribing, smuggling, lending, or praying at the correct moments, then civilization continues beneath the ornamental changes. This too is Calimshan. At some point during the long southern ages, Calimshan merged with the realm of Mir and became Calimshan in the fuller sense later eras remember. Notice how unromantic that is. One might hope for a single blazing coronation, the sort of moment painters adore and historians distrust. Instead, as so often, a long-lived political identity emerges through combination, consolidation, adaptation, and administrative continuation. That is why it lasts. Spectacle is excellent at founding myths. It is far less reliable at founding tax systems. Here, we begin to see the rise of the priest kings, known as Bakals. In the early and Middle Ages of Calimshan, religion, governance, and social order intertwined through these sacred rulers and their dynasties. Do not mistake this for a duplicate of Mulhorand or Unther. The resemblance exists, but the structure differs. In Mulhorand and Unther, divine presence is central in a more immediate mythic and national sense. In Calimshan, sacred rulership becomes part of a continuity shaped not only by theology, but by older genie legacy, civic centralization, hereditary authority, and the demands of governing an old, stratified coastal civilization. The Bakals remind us that Calimshan was not simply a merchant culture all the way down. Many casual summaries flatten the realm into trade, spice, decadence, and intrigue. Those are visible layers. Beneath them lay religious authority, old dynastic legitimacy, sacrificial narratives of rulership, wars against neighbors, and ideological programs of expansion. A pious tyrant may still be a tyrant. A holy court may still smell of accounts, fear, and polished knives. Some Bakal dynasties were more expansionist, more cruel, or more unstable than others. Certain later rulers pushed hard against neighboring dwarven realms and against the peoples of lands that would become crucial in later episodes, including Tether and adjoining regions. This matters because the South does not remain contained. Calimshan projects force outward, and that force leaves descendants. The frontier fort, the conquered town, the enslaved laborer, the tribute route, the imported artisan, the garrison marrying locally and producing mixed loyalties 2 generations later. All of these are part of how old powers become larger than their ceremonial maps. One harsh dynasty in particular is remembered for aggressive expansion, the development of a stronger navy, and the enslavement of conquered populations. Again, the pattern returns. Maritime capacity, urban wealth, organized hierarchy, and ideological confidence encourage outward movement. Why would they not? A realm with ports, money, shipping knowledge, and administrative depth almost always concludes that neighboring lands would benefit from its guidance, taxes, and armed visitation. Empires are remarkably consistent in this self-assessment. Now we must look directly at the thing too many celebrants of antique civilization prefer to keep draped behind curtains. Slavery in Calimshan is not an incidental blemish. It is not a regrettable side custom one may mention solemnly before returning to the architecture. It is structural. From the gen brought by Calim through later dynastic labor systems, through conquest, urban wealth, household economies, military logistics, and elite display, slavery recurs as one of the engines of the realm's endurance. This matters historically, morally, and analytically. Historically, because slave labor helps explain how such enormous wealth, such elaborate city life, such concentrated elite luxury, and such resilient infrastructure could be sustained. Morally, because no account of Calimshan deserves admiration unless it looks that truth in the face. Analytically, because stratified societies do not merely use slavery, they are shaped by it. Household structure changes, policing changes, law changes, ideas of rank harden. Public cruelty becomes legible as order. Manumission, patronage, bought freedom, debt, and bonded service all begin to blur in socially useful ways for those at the top. When a city depends upon coerced labor for generations, even its ideas of elegance change. Consider the house of a wealthy pasha. Its cool courtyards, veiled galleries, storerooms, kitchens, gardens, stables, reception rooms, and private apartments do not function by grace. They function by labor. Someone grinds grain, someone carries water, someone accounts for linens, someone cleans lamps, someone tends animals, someone copies letters, someone guards doors, someone overhears conversations that may later purchase another day of survival. In such a household, refinement is distributed unequally. Leisure at the center requires exhaustion at the edges. The same is true of the city. The spice market glitters because porters haul, clerks tally, guards extort, sailors unload, warehouse hands stack, stable boys shovel, sweepers clear refuse, and unseen people patch what heat, salt, and traffic always erode. The broader and older the city, the more invisible labor it consumes. Calimport, above all, consumed labor on a scale that made its splendor appear natural to those who benefited from it. If you have ever seen a polished court and wondered how such perfect surfaces are maintained, the answer is simple and unpleasant. Many hands, not all free. And yet Calimshan cannot be reduced to this cruelty either, however central it is. That would be another kind of simplification. A civilization is rarely explained by one vice, no matter how deep the vice runs. Calimshan also sustained trade networks of extraordinary reach, artisanal excellence, financial sophistication, military and naval capacity, dense urban culture, historical scholarship of a certain self-serving but nonetheless valuable sort, and a remarkable capacity for absorbing conquerors, fashions, faiths, and shocks without ceasing to be recognizably itself. This is why it fascinates, not because it is pure, because it persists. Let us dwell for a while inside the machinery of that persistence. Take first the port. Calimport's harbour remained one of the great engines of southern power. A port of such scale is not just a place where ships arrive. It is an institution with its own temporal rhythm. Dawn and tide determine labour. Convoys determine expectation. Monsoon patterns, prevailing winds, pirate seasons, diplomatic weather, and the condition of distant roads all translate into the city's mood. A good harbour year swells credit, confidence, construction, and ambition. A bad one sharpens knives, accelerates factional accusation, and fills noble halls with that most dangerous of substances, underemployed pride. Old Calimport learned to live by this rhythm across dynasties. Merchants from inland routes brought grain, metals, timber, crafted wares and captives. Sea captains brought spices, luxuries, gossip, pilgrims, mercenaries, scholars, charlatans, and disease. Tariffs tied them all to authority. The state, whether priest ruled, dynastically administered, or later bent beneath imperial overlays, always understood that to govern Calimport was to stand with one hand on the dock ledger and the other on the sword. This is not decadence. It is competence wearing silk. The same can be said of titles. Later, Kalishite society became famous and occasionally infamous for its intricate hierarchy of titles, ranks, offices, and honorifics. Northern visitors often mock such systems until they discover too late that they have insulted 3 guilds, a harbour magistrate, a priestly lineage, and the aunt of a naval factor by omitting the wrong syllable. Laugh if you like. I have found that people who deride elaborate etiquette are usually people who benefit from another etiquette so normalized they no longer notice it. In Calimshan, titles do important work. They distribute status. They clarify authority in a crowded, stratified environment. They encode economic relationships and social obligations. They flatter. They threaten. They distinguish old money from new priestly authority from mercantile command, provincial dignity from metropolitan ambition. A title can be vanity. It can also be law in ceremonial dress. That, again, is continuity, the transformation of power into manner until manner itself becomes one of power's primary tools. If Calimshan as a realm teaches continuity through governance, Calimport as a city teaches continuity through layering. This is one of the episode's central insights, and I want you to hear it not as metaphor alone, but as urban fact. Calimport did not endure by preserving each age intact like a jeweled box on a shelf. It endured by building over itself, through itself, and out of itself. Fire, riot, siege, plague, dynastic correction, and reconstruction each altered the city. Walls shifted, quarters changed, Temples rose where warehouses once stood. Older mansions became government storehouses, then barracks, then noble compounds again, then collapsed into foundations upon which a new award was laid. Streets widened here, narrowed there, were bridged, covered, rerouted, renamed, forgotten, rediscovered, and folded back into the functioning city. In some accounts of later Kalimport, one hears of the shadow city beneath the living one, older structures, rooms, forgotten ways, sunken streets, and buried districts persisting below current traffic. Of course they do. That is what a city of repeated reconstruction becomes. Kalimport is archaeology one can still be murdered in. Dry wit aside, this layered physicality is politically important. A rebuilt city retains memory in stone, even when official memory becomes selective. A noble house may claim antiquity because its current residence incorporates an older courtyard wall from a previous dynasty. A temple may declare sacred legitimacy because its crypts descend into chambers used 3 regimes earlier. A smuggler may know a route because a flood collapsed a later warehouse into an older drainage system. A magistrate may lose sleep because a land dispute turns out to involve title claims extending into phases of the city for which surviving records are incomplete, contradictory, or in a script no one in the office actually reads, without consulting a scholar who charges offensively by the hour. Cities like this do not forget cleanly. They misremember, they repurpose, they aestheticize, they deny, they ritualize. But beneath the official version, earlier uses persist like roots under paving stones. This is why conquest changes regime more easily than civilization. A conqueror may seize the palace. He may replace the banner, alter the coinage, issue new decrees, reassign barracks, favor different gods, promote his cousins, and execute a disagreeable number of former officials for the sake of theatrical clarity. Yet by the next harvest, he still needs dock workers, translators, grain weights, caravan intelligence, warehouse keys, irrigation labor, customs clerks, urban patrols, navigators, masons, and people who know which district can be taxed harder without immediate fire. He still needs the city to function. Sooner or later, the city begins teaching him how he must rule it. Calimshan excelled at this instruction. Now let us walk a little further through its ages. After the founding centuries and the long Khorramshan continuity, later eras of Calimshan saw dynastic sequences, priestly rule, calamities, recoveries, artistic flourish, military aggression, and periods of comparative retrenchment. Sages of the South, delighting in classification almost as much as in self-congratulation, divided Calimshan's long past into numerous ages and periods. This taxonomy tells us something. A civilization begins naming its own eras when it has enough continuity to look back upon itself, not merely as ancestry, but as archive. Some ages were marked by priestly dynasties whose rulers fused sacral identity with temporal domination. Some by palace intrigues and assassination, some by plague, some by reconstruction, some by expansion outward into neighboring lands, some by a relative turn toward patronage of the arts, refinement, and self-display after the exhausting costs of conquest. This movement between outward aggression and inward ornament is not a contradiction. It is often the same wealth seeking 2 different expressions. Consider the Sunset Plague, which later accounts place among the severe catastrophes that nearly depopulated Calimport and left the city empty or nearly so for generations by the standards of ordinary folk, though only briefly by the standards of civilizations. Such an event would annihilate a lesser urban system. Yet Calimport returned. Why? Because the logic of place remained. The harbour was still there, the roots were still there. The memory of centrality remained. Whatever tomb smoke hung above the streets for a century, the reasons for rebuilding did not vanish. A city does not endure because it is lucky. It endures because too many surrounding systems require its return. And so, Calimport returned, again and again. This is the machine for surviving conquest and catastrophe the outline asked us to linger upon, and rightly so. Let us describe its components carefully. First, location. A superb harbour at a strategic junction is historical magnetism. Goods want to pass there, power wants to tax there, fleets want to anchor there, diplomats want to negotiate there, criminals want to vanish there. If a city with such advantages burns, someone will rebuild it. Second, accumulated expertise. Sailors, pilots, factors, scribes, brokers, caravan masters, shipwrights, moneylenders, guards, translators and builders form a civic memory not fully dependent on dynastic continuity. Kill a ruler, and these people still know how the place works. Indeed, many have a financial interest in surviving him. Third, distributed complicity. This is an unpleasant but accurate phrase. In a stratified trade civilization, many layers of society profit from the continued functioning of the system, even when they dislike its apex. Merchants resent nobles, nobles distrust guilds, priests condemn particular luxuries while living off donations derived from them. Officers sneer at traders until payroll is due, and ordinary laborers curse everyone while still needing the port open. Such mutual dependency creates resilience, not justice, resilience. Fourth, adaptable legitimacy. Calimshan proved able to cloak authority in many garments: divine sanction, dynastic continuity, mercantile necessity, military defense, inherited prestige, old blood, urban centrality, even aesthetic superiority. Whenever one mode of legitimacy frayed, another could be drawn across the throne. Fifth, historical vanity. Do not underestimate this. Civilizations that know they are old can endure out of pride alone through periods that would shame a younger realm into dissolution. The people of Calimshan did not simply inhabit an old land. Many of them cherished the idea that theirs was an old and superior civilization. Such pride can blind. It can also preserve. Now, pride deserves its own scrutiny. Northern accounts often caricature Calishite pride as softness, sensuality, or theatrical excess. This is the sort of analysis one gets from people whose own courts wear too much fur and assume that any culture using perfume must be hiding decadence. Ignore them. Calishite pride is civilizational. It is the pride of a people conscious of antiquity, urbanity, linguistic distinctiveness, trade sophistication, and the ability to persist while cruder powers exhaust themselves, proving how stern they are. This pride expresses itself in dress, architecture, etiquette, cuisine, religious patronage, household form, naming conventions, and public ceremony, yes. But beneath all that lies something colder. an assumption that Calimshan has seen would-be correctives come and go. Barbarian moralizing, foreign conquest, religious reform, northern mockery, local revolt, and plague have all attempted to humble it. Yet still, the market's open. There is arrogance in this. There is also evidence. Let us speak of architecture for a moment, since people so often speak of it badly. When I say that genie and elemental legacy shaped Calimshan's built environment, I do not mean that every arch is secretly magical or every courtyard a relic of a genie blueprint. I mean something subtler and more powerful. Cultures inherit taste from the circumstances of their founding, especially when those circumstances are dramatic enough to become sacred memory. Monumentality, airflow, waterworks, shaded interiority, sea-facing strength, ornamental luxury, and a comfort with scale all become legible differently in a realm whose oldest stories involve elemental lords, slave-built capitals, and landscapes remade by catastrophic power. Even later, when the original masters are long gone, one can still find southern fascination with cooled interiors, high walls, gardens of managed water against hostile heat, harbour defences of astonishing ambition, and civic ornament that insists abundance can be staged against barrenness. This is not merely decoration. It is ideology in stucco and stone. It says, we are the people who made order flourish, where the land itself remembers war and desiccation. The harbour walls of Calimport are emblematic here. Later tradition credits their oldest, mightiest forms to genie craftsmanship of unimaginable scale, ancient sea defences, and works beneath the water older than many dynasties that later used them. Whether every stone now visible belongs to that earliest phase matters less than the continuity of the story. The city told itself that its harbour was no ordinary dockland, but a legacy of primeval power. That belief, in turn, shaped how later rulers understood what they were preserving. And preservation in Calimshan is always selective. Old dynastic quarters may be demolished while harbour works are endlessly repaired. A temple may fall into neglect while an ancestral title is preserved in ceremony. A district's poor may be displaced to beautify an avenue leading to a palace built on slave money, raised through taxes levied on merchants who complain about corruption over sherbet and figs. The civilization survives, yes, but not for everyone equally. Never let admiration for continuity blur the question of who continuity serves. So let us descend from dynasties and harbours into the streets. What did daily life in a mature Calishite urban civilization feel like? Not in one universal way, of course. Only bad historians and conquerors believe cities have single experiences. But there are patterns we may responsibly trace. For the wealthy, life was structured by household rank, patronage, display, alliances, religious observance, business interests, and the ceaseless management of status. A powerful family in Calimport did not merely own property. It inhabited a web. Guild contacts, palace connections, ship investments, caravan partnerships, priestly obligations, marriage negotiations, household slaves and servants, hired guards, educated scribes, clients in outer districts, rivals in adjacent wards, and debtors in inland towns, all formed part of daily consciousness. To rise in such a world required more than money. It required performance of cultivated superiority. That performance could take many forms. One family displayed piety through temple endowment. Another displayed refinement through patronage of poets, musicians, architects, or calligraphers. Another displayed power through armed retainers and private compounds with too many locked doors. Another displayed antiquity through genealogy, whether authentic or corrected by professional liars. Another displayed commercial reach through exotic goods, rare foods, or ownership stakes in vessels whose names alone implied profitable distance. Beneath this elite layer lived the professional strata that make old cities possible. Factors, brokers, money handlers, translators, scribes, navigators, soldiers, artisans, physicians, accountants, shipwrights, builders, perfumers, metal workers, leather workers, glass workers, carpet sellers, warehouse managers, judges, temple officials, and all the other steady hands without whom prestige becomes hungry and absurd. Calimshan did not endure on nobles alone. It endured on specialists. These strata often experience history differently from rulers. Dynastic change may alarm them, but it also offers opportunity. A new court needs skilled people. A new tariff schedule needs interpretation. A new religious fashion requires icons, robes, incense, copied texts, and legal harmonization. In societies of strong continuity, the middling professional classes can become the true carriers of civilization from one age to the next. Not because they are morally better, because they keep systems alive. Below and around them lay laborers, sailors, porters, teamsters, field hands, fisherfolk, market women, hawkers, hired muscle, tenant farmers tied to estates, freed persons of uncertain standing, the urban poor, and of course the enslaved in many forms. Their Calimshan was harsher, more immediate, more vulnerable to price shocks, grain shortages, epidemic, arbitrary punishment, and elite amusement. Yet they too made culture. Street dialects, neighborhood solidarities, practical piety, jokes at the expense of the mighty, smuggling customs, songs of labor and loss, the small economies of shared survival. These are no less civilizational than palaces, though palaces receive the better painters. And then there are the outsiders within. Every great port accumulates them. Some arrive to stay, some stay because departure becomes impossible. Foreign merchants establish hostels or houses. Sellswords seek contracts. Refugees carry their old feuds into new alleys. Priests of distant gods negotiate local tolerance. Scholars come in search of manuscripts and discover that the archive is controlled by men who expect bribes as a form of intellectual hospitality. Sailors marry locally, captives are sold, freedmen rise. Adventurers with too little tact and too much confidence learn which districts permit swagger and which answer it by relieving the swaggerer of purse, teeth, or breath. Calimshan has always known how to absorb such people without ceasing to be itself. That is not tolerance in the modern sentimental sense, it is metabolization. The city consumes newcomers, assigns them place, value, risk, and price, and in time incorporates what is useful. Cities of this age are far less interested in purity than in control. Now, because we are speaking of a southern realm often misrepresented by outsiders, I must say something unfashionable but necessary. Distinctiveness is not exoticism. These are not the same. Calimshan's fabrics, foodways, urban design, naming practices, social etiquette, and merchant cultures are not stage dressing for northern adventures. They are expressions of a long historical process shaped by climate, trade, conquest, religion, and deep civic memory. Do you understand the insult hidden in lazy description? To call a civilization exotic is often to confess that one has noticed its surfaces without doing the labor of understanding its structure. So let us understand structure. Calimshan differs from many northern polities because urbanity sits at its center. Not every Calishite is urban, of course. There are farms, villages, estates, caravan towns, fishing settlements, marches, rough frontiers, provincial forts, and local domains far from palace splendor. But the self-image of the civilization is decisively urban and courtly. The city is where power becomes visible. The port is where wealth becomes measurable. The court is where rank becomes legible. Even rural wealth tends to desire urban recognition. This has consequences. First, politics becomes highly mediated. Personal bravery matters, but usually a spectacle within structures of wealth, patronage, and household power. Second, literacy and record-keeping become more central. A civilization of old ports and old taxes produces papers, ledgers, archives, decrees, title disputes, and scribal lineages. Third, social mobility becomes possible in certain lanes while remaining brutally restricted overall. A clever merchant may rise, a military officer may win office, a freed slave may become prosperous. Yet the system does not cease to be hierarchical because a few people climb it. In truth, such examples often strengthen hierarchy by allowing the powerful to point upward and call the ladder fair. Fourth, memory becomes civic rather than merely tribal. This is one of Calimshan's great distinctions. In newer or rougher lands, memory often clings foremost to clan, village, tribe, or immediate fealty. In Calimshan, memory is urbanized. Streets remember, harbor wards remember, merchant families remember, temples remember, administrative offices remember. Dynasties seek to monopolize that memory, but they never fully succeed because the city stores recollection in too many places at once. This is why Kalimport could survive near abandonment and return. The idea of Kalimport existed not merely in stone, but in countless habits, routes learned by captains, accounts held by merchants, prestige claimed by nobles, curses muttered by laborers, devotional circuits walked by priests, and long-distance expectations held by foreigners who still thought of the harbor as necessary. Cities become immortal that way, not by avoiding death, but by becoming indispensable enough to be resurrected repeatedly. Calimshan's language and naming customs also matter here. Algedo and its associated titles, offices, and family forms did more than label society. They helped preserve it. Language is a surprisingly stubborn technology of continuity. Regimes change, but the vocabulary of rank, office, land, commerce, and insult remains. Once a people has names for its relationships, it can survive the replacement of individual occupants. The form endures beyond the person. The same is true of religion, though here the story is more tangled. Calimshan's long history includes devotions shaped by local practice, imported faiths, imperial needs, genie veneration, priestly rulership, and later broad Faerûnian cultic patterns. I will not flatten it into one neat lineage. That would be false. What matters for our purposes is that religion in Calimshan often operated as both sincere devotion and civic glue. Temples stabilized neighborhoods, legitimized rulers, received elite patronage, employed scribes and artisans, mediated charity, and provided ceremonial vocabulary through which power spoke about itself. A ruler who funds a temple is not always pious. Sometimes he is merely literate in public control. Even so, devotion need not be false because it is useful. Ordinary believers can be sincere within institutions their betters exploit. This is another habit of old civilizations. Many motives occupy the same ritual. And over all of this, like heat over stone, lies the matter of shame. I said earlier that history in Calimshan is not a ruin outside town, but the street plan, palace, noble title, spice market, and inherited shame. We must now linger on that last phrase. Inherited shame is one of the most structurally important forces in a civilization's self-understanding, especially when it is denied. Calimshan bears several kinds. The foundational shame of slavery, the shame of cruelty normalized into culture, the shame of elite luxury funded by coerced toil, the shame of conquest dressed as refinement, the shame of building civility atop repeated dispossession, the shame, too, of knowing that foreign observers are not wholly wrong in some of their harshest judgments, and therefore becoming defensive, grandiose, or selectively honest in response. Civilizations rarely confess such shame in public. Instead, they convert it. They sublimate it into ceremony, national pride, heightened etiquette, genealogical obsession, artistic patronage, moral superiority, or stories in which former victimhood excuses later domination. Look carefully at old powers, and you will often see this conversion at work. Calimshan, being very old, has had a long time to practice it. This does not make the people uniquely hypocritical, only human. But historians must note the mechanism. A realm that begins under slavery and later becomes a slave-holding civilization will tell stories about order, destiny, refinement, prosperity, and the burdens of rule. It will congratulate itself on manners. It will contrast its sophistication with the roughness of outsiders. It will insist that hierarchy is natural because the alternative is chaos. In doing so, it will build a moral architecture sturdy enough to let many decent people live within indecent structures without feeling themselves monsters. You see why memory is such dangerous work. It is not enough to know what happened. One must also understand how later generations learn to live with what happened. Let us now turn outward again and consider Calimshan not only as an old city-state writ vast, but as a southern civilizational counterweight to assumptions many listeners carry without noticing. Much of the popular imagination of Faerûn is northern: forest tracks, frontier keeps, snowbound passes, half-repaired roads, taverns where strangers arrive one at a time, under cloaks still wet from travel, kingdoms young enough to remember their own founding without consulting 3 dynastic libraries and a bitter uncle. There is nothing wrong with such places. Many produce excellent adventures and mediocre wine. But Calimshan belongs to another historical mode. It is not frontier, it is sediment. It is not a land where the first question is, who settled here? It is a land where the first useful question is, which layer of settlement are we discussing, and who is pretending the previous one does not count? It is not a realm defined primarily by sparse space and heroic improvisation, but by density, memory, institution, and the long management of inherited complexity. This does not make it safer. often the opposite. A frontier kills you openly. An old city can arrange for your disappearance with archivally satisfying precision. The southern distinction also appears in how power presents itself. In many younger lands, legitimacy leans hard on martial virtue. The ruler must be seen fighting, hunting, riding, standing physically in the dangerous landscape. In Calimshan, although military power never ceases to matter, authority is more often staged through command of abundance. Palaces, receiving halls, imported luxuries, disciplined households, adorned courts, orderly ceremonies, patronage networks, urban spectacle, and the visible ability to make the city continue around oneself. The ruler who can keep the harbour full, the roads guarded, the grain moving, and the noble houses uncertain which of them is about to be favoured, has already demonstrated a formidable form of strength. This is why old South Country politics often appears to northerners as deceitful, decadent, or soft. What they are reacting to is not softness, it is abstraction. They are watching power operate through systems they cannot easily dramatize in the old, heroic language. A bargain can be deadlier than a duel. A tariff can conquer what a spear cannot hold. A marriage, debt instrument, temple endowment, or shipping compact can redraw the political future more thoroughly than a battlefield triumph that bards remember with gratifying simplicity. Calimshan knew this very well. That knowledge did not prevent war. It made war more integrated into broader systems of wealth and rule. Fleets protect trade, yes, but trade finances fleets. Garrisons secure routes, but routes justify taxation. Nobles posture over honor, but honor is never far from who controls which estates, ports, or marriage claims. Even cultural patronage participates. The poet praising a ruler may also be broadcasting an ideology of legitimacy. The architect designing a gate may be teaching subjects how power wishes to be seen. The historian employed by a pasha is performing fortification by other means. I sympathize with the historians, naturally. Even when they are wrong, they are at least using ink instead of cavalry. Now, picture a day in Kalimport, at the height of its mature life. The harbour is already awake before dawn. Mooring crews shout, lanterns gutter in the marine haze, barges nose between anchored vessels. Stevedores unload bales, jars, timber, casks, ore, fine goods packed for inland transport, cheap goods packed in insulting quantities, and human beings whose presence in the manifest will be disguised if the client is respectable and paraded if he is powerful enough not to care. Customs officials inspect, negotiate, threaten, and recalculate. Temple bells or calls mark the hour in competing soundscapes. A moneylender's clerk arrives with sealed instructions. A factor from a noble house pretends not to be bribing the harbour office because his bribe arrives in the form of a perfectly legal gratuity accompanied by fruit and a phrasing so ornate it counts as emotional laundering. Above, in better-aired quarters, household servants stir courtyards to life. Water is brought, draperies tied back, breakfast prepared, messages copied. Younger sons coached in manners, letters, or deceit, depending on the family curriculum. Daughters of rank begin the day's cycle of management, negotiation, or strategic invisibility according to custom, household, and temperament. Priests receive petitions. Guards rotate posts. Lawyers, who are the revenge of civilization upon optimism, unfold their tablets and smile for no clear reason. By midday, the markets are fully alive. Spice, cloth, crafted metal, perfumes, dried fruit, charms, forged documents, devotional wares, imported curiosities, household slaves, livestock, scrolls, surgical tools, weapons, carpets, oils, inks, and rumors all change hands. Here, the scale of Kalishite stratification becomes visible. A silk merchant glides past a man who has sold his labor by the day. A noble retainer inspects swords beside a caravan guard counting copper. A scholar searches for a damaged manuscript in a stall whose owner cannot read but knows value by smell, age, and how suddenly learned customers stop breathing when they see something. Do not underestimate those stall owners. Civilizations survive because practical intelligence refuses to wear ceremonial robes. Meanwhile, in districts less visible to travelers composing sentimental memoirs, women bargain over food, children disappear into alleys where hazard and opportunity share walls, labor gangs mend surfaces that heat and use have broken, freedmen attempt to keep their precarious foothold. The enslaved move through errands, exhaustion, and private calculations of risk, and neighborhood networks quietly decide who among the poor will eat, who will be cheated, who will be protected, and who has become inconvenient enough to be handed over when the next sweep of authority comes through. This is city life, not one thing, many things stacked. At evening, the city does not simplify. It changes register. Taverns and private salons receive different classes of confidence. Dealings too delicate for daylight advance. Smugglers move. Temple observance intensifies in some quarters, while revelry blooms in others. Guards grow either sharper or lazier according to district and bribery. Storytellers recite histories made cleaner than the day deserved. Musicians perform for patrons whose ancestors may have financed half the local suffering and still expect applause on the beat. And through all of it, the city keeps accounts. That is Calimshan's genius. Not that it feels no passion, it feels tremendous passion, but it writes ledgers around it. This is also why conquest so often fails to erase it. Conquerors arrive imagining they have taken possession of a city. In truth, they have acquired responsibility for a vast and irritable process already in motion. To rule Kalimport, one must decide where to stand in relation to guilds, priesthoods, noble houses, port offices, market districts, caravan interests, urban militias, outer estates, and the innumerable unofficial networks by which information moves faster than decree. An outsider may seize command, but unless he masters the process educates him harshly. Look across Calimshan's ages and you will see this education repeated. Dynasties fall, administrative forms shift, foreign influences arrive, regions are lost or won. Yet the civilization retains certain core instincts. It centralizes around old cities, it values trade, it normalizes hierarchy, it stages legitimacy with care, it remembers its antiquity, it converts shame into ceremony, it preserves infrastructure when possible, it returns to forms of slavery and domination even when temporarily corrected. It projects power outward when wealth and confidence permit. And when catastrophe strikes, it rebuilds instead of relocating the center entirely. That last point deserves emphasis. Many realms confronted with repeated destruction eventually abandon the cursed site and begin elsewhere. Calimshan, or more precisely Calimport, repeatedly did not. Why? Because place itself had become power. The harbour could not be copied cheaply. The accumulated prestige could not be moved intact. The merchant houses would not consent to exile unless compelled. The roads and sea routes already pointed there. The old palaces, even ruined, lent authority to whatever new regime could occupy or rebuild them. A fresh city inland might be safer from some threats, perhaps even morally cleaner in imagination. But it would not be Calimport, and so the old city persisted. Now we must say something of neighbouring peoples and the violence of Kalishite continuity, because no civilization this old and centralized exists without having stepped upon others. The dwarves of Shanatar and later related southern realms knew Calimshan not as picturesque antiquity, but as rival, trading partner, aggressor, and corrupter by turns. Elven forests to the north and east did not simply furnish scenic borders. They represented competing claims upon land, timber, movement, and the very question of what sort of order ought to prevail. Human populations in lands later drawn into Kalishite orbit experienced Calimshan not as abstract culture, but as tax demand, military presence, slave raid, road network, luxury market, or opportunity for advancement under alien elites. When southern dynasties extended control into regions that would later concern Tethyr and Amn, they were not merely expanding lines on parchment. They were exporting Kalishite assumptions that urban centers should dominate hinterlands, that old civilization grants entitlement, that labor may be compelled, that conquered peoples can be slotted into hierarchy, and that maritime commercial logic may properly direct inland life. These assumptions leave deep marks. Entire later regional tensions depend on them. This is why Calimshan is so important as groundwork for the episodes to come. The Shun Imperium does not emerge from nowhere. Neither do the later political cultures of Amn and Tethyr. Southern empire building, merchant aristocracy, plantation wealth, noble pretension, and the uneasy relationship between old Kalishite models and local identities all depend upon the civilizational depth we are tracing tonight. Calimshan is not merely an old kingdom. It is a generator of later southern political habits. And because it is a generator, it is also a warning. For all its sophistication, Calimshan repeatedly demonstrates how infrastructure and cruelty can become mutually sustaining. Ports enrich, wealth stabilizes, stabilization preserves hierarchy. Hierarchy secures elite control over labor. Elite control over labor funds further magnificence. Magnificence then persuades later generations that the civilization must have possessed unusual wisdom, since look how splendidly it built. This is the oldest confidence trick in urban history. Great buildings do not prove good souls. Still, nor do they prove hollow ones. We must not become simplistic in the opposite direction. Calimshan genuinely cultivated art, craft, language, legal complexity, seafaring knowledge, historical consciousness, and urban sophistication worthy of serious respect. It built durable things because many capable people, some privileged and some profoundly unfree, knew what they were doing. The problem is not that the civilization was false. The problem is that it was real enough to make its injustices durable too. There is the tragedy, not ruin, continuity. A collapsing tyranny may kill fewer generations than a stable, graceful, administratively competent one. There is another reason old Calimshan resists simplification. It was never only Calimport. A civilization may centralize around one overwhelming city and still require other urban temperaments to express its full political life. Memnon, for example, preserves in its very name the memory of the Afriti rival whose struggle with Calim helped shape the region. Later ages knew it as a military and strategic counterweight, a harsher port, a gateway, a place where soldiery, garrison logic, and harder civic moods stood more visibly than in the cosmopolitan sprawl of Calimport. Where Calimport could seem like the realm's brain or stomach, depending on whether you asked a scholar or a cynic, Memnon often appeared more like an armored hand. This matters because old civilizations do not survive on culture alone. They survive on differentiated institutions. One city handles finance and prestige, another handles mustering and transit, another processes local agriculture, another anchors a provincial coast, another protects an approach, another serves as court retreat, naval yard, pilgrimage center, or tax funnel. The realm persists not by possessing one magnificent jewel, but by learning how a necklace holds together. Calimshan learned that lesson very early. Even its road and caravan culture reflects it. Merchants moved not through empty desert fantasy, but along managed and contested routes linking estates, wells, fortifications, market towns, mountain passes, and ports. Caravanserais, patrol arrangements, mercenary contracts, tribal negotiations, and local tribute systems all formed part of the practical state. A realm that lives by exchange must build not merely cities, but connective tissue. Those roads in turn become instruments of empire. March an army down a caravan route once, and every later toll station remembers it. Here then is one of the season's recurring questions in southern form. What does it mean to inherit old infrastructure? In Calimshan, to inherit a road is to inherit the tax logic that built it, the violence that protected it, the labor that maintained it, the settlements that grew beside it, and the neighboring peoples who resent or depend upon it. To inherit a port is to inherit not just berths and walls, but obligation to the sea, the merchant classes, the underworld, the navy, and foreign powers who have grown used to finding you there. To inherit a palace is to inherit archives, servants, patronage lists, grudges, hidden doors, and the very posture by which rulership has been expected to appear. No wonder old states become conservative. Their buildings keep reminding them who they have been. And yet, Calimshan was never static. This is another falsehood often told about old civilizations, that continuity equals stillness. Hardly. Calimshan changed constantly. It absorbed new peoples, lost provinces, regained influence by commerce where arms failed, shifted in religious patterns, altered elite composition, rebuilt urban wards, produced new dynasties, suffered old noble lines to fall and strange new men to rise. A clever outsider, if rich or useful enough, could find a place. A foolish aristocrat, if vain or reckless enough, could lose one. This is precisely how old societies remain alive. They change without admitting, except in the privacy of ledgers, how much they have changed. There is a certain elegance in that hypocrisy. You see it in food as well as finance, in accent as well as office, in household layout as well as lore. Goods and customs arriving by sea are domesticated, relabeled, woven into existing habits, and in time retroactively declared almost native. This, too, is power. A great civilization does not simply trade, it digests. But digestion can be brutal. The smaller culture, the poorer quarter, the conquered hinterland, the imported laboring group, or the enslaved population may be incorporated only by losing parts of itself. One should not praise absorption without asking what has been dissolved. Calimshan's treatment of difference, therefore, deserves exact language. It was not a closed realm in the simple sense. Old ports cannot afford such purity, nor was it an easy pluralism. Its cosmopolitanism often took the form of hierarchy. Many kinds of people might be present. Presence is not equality. Trade across peoples is not justice among them. A harbour can welcome foreign coin while despising foreign bodies. A court can patronize exotic fashions while enslaving the wearer's cousins. An empire can speak many languages through translators while allowing only one of them to set taxes. I emphasize this because modern listeners, and indeed many naive adventurers in any age, are too easily enchanted by crowded bazaars. Crowds feel like diversity. Diversity feels like tolerance. This is not always false, but it can be dangerously incomplete. One must always ask, who may walk where, who may own what, who may speak without fear, who can buy protection, and who is always purchasable by others. That is where a civilization's ethics become visible. On those measures, Calimshan could be magnificent and ugly in the same breath. Now I want to speak of memory more directly, because no old realm maintains itself without a disciplined culture of remembering and misremembering. Calimshan's memory is layered across chronicles, family lines, religious traditions, civic architecture, household lore, courtly etiquette, and the geography itself. A noble family might preserve a tale of descent from ancient courtiers who served a Bakal dynasty. A coastal household might tell stories of storms in language still inflected by forgotten elemental fears. A military lineage in Memnon might claim continuity with defenders who held a gate 5 regimes ago. Priests might maintain festival calendars whose origins lie in ancient political settlement disguised as devotion. Merchants might treasure account books as if they were relics, and in a sense they are. An old city remembers itself in invoices no less than in epics. This is what distinguishes genuine antiquity from costume. A young realm can purchase old-looking columns. It cannot purchase 1,000 petty practices whose origins nobody quite recalls, but everybody still obeys. It cannot purchase layered legal language, inherited insults, district rivalries older than the current ruling house, or the instinctive way a population knows which gates flood first, which plazas are for ceremony, which shrines are politically dangerous, and which old neighborhoods still mutter against a conquest centuries dead. Calimshan possessed that thickness, and thickness changes the experience of time. In a young realm, 50 years may feel foundational. In Calimshan, 50 years can be weather. A dynasty's great reform may occupy no more emotional space 3 centuries later than a particularly memorable storm occupies in a fishing village. This does not mean events do not matter. It means the civilization has developed a longer denominator for significance. That can be wise. It can also be cruel. Long memory cultures are good at endurance, but they are often bad at urgency where reform is concerned. If a suffering class has only endured for 3 generations, the elite may shrug and call that an unfortunate fluctuation. You begin to see why old civilizations can be so resilient and so morally exhausting. Let us also note the peculiar role of myth in such a society. Calim, Memnon, the desert, the crystal, the old genie works, the stories of ancient betrayals and bindings, the rumors of noble blood touched by elemental ancestry, the persistence of names rooted in impossible antiquity. All of these give Calimshan a mythic underlayer that never fully recedes into mere legend. In some lands, the supernatural past is mostly ruin and priestly story. In Calimshan, it remains ambient. The people know that their oldest narratives are attached to visible landforms, city sites, artifacts, titles, and occasionally to families quite willing to imply that a touch of ancient otherworldly distinction still perfumes their veins. Whether such claims are true in any particular case is almost secondary. Their social function is what matters. They confer glamour, danger, legitimacy, or at least dinner party conversation. It is in this atmosphere that high urban culture and dangerous magic often make uneasy neighbors. Calimshan was never Netheril. Its greatness was not primarily a matter of arcanists turning magic into public infrastructure on the Netherese model. Nor was it Jamdath, where disciplined mind became civic principle. Nor Mulhorand, where visible divine ordering saturated state life. Calimshan's distinctiveness lies in how ancient magical legacy, trade wealth, hierarchical urbanity, and deep civic continuity intertwine without any one of those elements wholly dominating the others. That mixture makes the South hard to categorize, which is one reason lazy people decline to try. I would urge you not to be lazy. Ask instead, what kind of imagination does Calimshan teach? It teaches scale. It teaches that wealth can outlast rulers. It teaches that cities are organisms of appetite as well as beauty. It teaches that slavery, once made foundational, will seek to reappear in every convenient niche, unless actively and repeatedly uprooted. It teaches that old wrongs may become old customs, and that old customs, when draped in elegance, become very hard to challenge. It teaches that geography is memory. It teaches that trade routes are political theology for secular men. It teaches that art can refine domination without cancelling it. It teaches, too, that civilizations which know themselves to be old wield age as argument. How many times in Faerûnian history has someone justified power by saying, in effect, we are old, therefore we are entitled? More than I care to count. Calimshan perfected that sentence so thoroughly it often no longer needed speaking aloud. And yet for all this severity, there is something genuinely admirable in its refusal to become provincial. Calimshan looked outward. It traded, it sailed, it absorbed. It compared itself against a wide world. Old powers that shut themselves away often decay into brittle purity fantasies. Calimshan, by contrast, remained engaged. That engagement sometimes corrupted others. It also kept the civilization intellectually and materially alive. You see, This is why simplistic judgment fails. The realm was not merely villainous, nor merely splendid. It was historical, which is worse for tidy morals and much better for understanding. Before we move toward our conclusion, we should place Calimshan within the broader Faerûnian pattern of empire building and cosmic consequence, because your outline quite rightly wants this episode to prepare ground for what follows. Calimshan's earliest phase begins with extraplanar arrogance and enslavement. Its later political life translates that violent beginning into human dynasties, priestly orders, merchant aristocracy, naval systems, and enduring urban wealth. In other words, the cosmic becomes administrative. This is a classic realms pattern. The old catastrophe never truly ends. It becomes society. Imaskar's planar crime yields later empires of the Mulan. The Crown Wars yield surface isolation and underdark civilizations. Netheril's magical overreach yields ruins, taboos, and successor myths. So too, Kalim's and Memnon's war yields not only desert and legend, but a human civilization permanently marked by the conditions under which it first learned scale, domination, and urban command. That is why this episode belongs where it does in the season. We are not wandering geographically for novelty. We are tracing how the middle shelves of Faerûn were stocked. Calimshan is one of those shelves that groans because so much later history rests upon it. Perhaps the most revealing transformation across the long ages of Calimshan is the way sacred, military, and mercantile forms of authority learn to inhabit one another. Early priest kings, dynastic lords, and old conquerors speak the language of overt dominion. Later, urban elites in Calimshan often speak a subtler dialect. Merchant power acquires noble habits. Noble power acquires commercial literacy. Rulership itself, in later Alcedo forms such as the Sil Pasha, carries within its style the marks of guild, office, layered authority, and urban command. Even the title's later resonances tell a story. Rule in Calimshan is not only kingly in the simple heroic sense. It is chiefship over chiefs, mastery over other masters, a knot of delegated and accumulated authority in a civilization where power is distributed through offices, houses, fleets, markets, and ceremonial precedents. I find this admirable in the way one admires an expertly forged chain. The chain still binds. Look at law. In a shallow society, law may remain largely customary, local, or personal. In an old port civilization, law proliferates. Contracts need enforcement, loans need terms, property needs records, harbor disputes need arbitration, slaves need classification because cruel societies are meticulous where ownership is concerned. Noble privilege needs codification, then loopholes, then lawyers to patrol the loopholes, and judges to pretend surprise when the loopholes prove popular. Religious endowments need administration. Tax exemptions need verification. Shipping loss needs valuation. Inheritance, marriage, wardship, debt, and bribery all need language refined enough to be simultaneously clear, deniable, and profitable. Calimshan therefore produces not merely rulers, but legal ecosystems. Do not underestimate what that means for continuity. A city whose wealth rests upon law, even partial and biased law, becomes difficult to abolish because too many interests are fixed in documents. Conquer the palace, yes, but who now owns Warehouse 39 on the Eastern Quay, whose debt instruments are secured by 3 cargoes not yet arrived, whose slaves were pledged against a noble household's military obligation, and whose religious tithes are tied to a shrine district likely to riot if unpaid. A conqueror who cannot answer such questions soon discovers that military victory is the easy portion of rule. In this way, old Calimshan turned paperwork into fortification. Then there is money. A civilization of deep-time trade does not merely possess wealth, it develops attitudes toward wealth. Wealth ceases to be only spoils or hoard and becomes flow, investment, credit, leverage, collateral display, obligation, and hereditary strategy. Merchant houses in such a world are not auxiliary to politics. They are politics, merely dressed in softer fabrics and better arithmetic. A noble who despises merchants while borrowing from them is not contradicting himself. He is participating in civilization. This too changes class culture. In a realm where trade power matters, elite masculinity does not need to be defined solely by battlefield prowess. It can be defined by command of households, ports, contracts, patronage webs, and maritime reach. Elite femininity, too, may involve far more political management, property strategy, and network control than crude outsider caricatures assume, even within systems that publicly constrain women in other ways. Old cities often hide female power in domestic spaces men wrongly consider apolitical until a succession crisis teaches them literacy. Remember that in every palace there is an official map and an actual map. The latter is usually carried partly in the minds of women, servants, old clerks, and those who know which doors are heard through. Calimshan surely knew this as well as any civilization ever did. Now consider the role of spectacle. A city like Kalimport survives partly because it makes centrality visible. Palaces, sea walls, temple complexes, grand markets, processions, receptions for foreign envoys, disciplined navies entering harbour, the carefully staged opulence of great houses, the visual glamour of wealth against desert and sea, all of this instructs inhabitants and visitors alike. It says, this place is not merely prosperous, it is the place prosperity comes to be measured. Spectacle, however, is expensive, which returns us to labor. I keep circling back because history keeps circling back. Grandeur consumes bodies. Once you see that, you begin to read cities differently. The polished stone floor becomes frozen hours of cutting, hauling, setting, scrubbing. The shaded garden becomes irrigation, horticulture, guarding, pruning, and the social power to divert water where others thirst. The banquet becomes supply chains. The embroidered canopy becomes fingers at work by dim light. The harbour full of masts becomes forests felled somewhere, rope twisted somewhere, wages disputed somewhere, storms survived by men whose names will never appear in the palace chronicle unless they mutiny spectacularly. This is not anti-civilizational bitterness. It is simply honest accounting. And yet, because Calimshan is genuinely civilizational, not just oppressive, it also transforms labor into craft at astonishing levels. We should honor that without romantic blindness. Kalishite artisans, builders, navigators, and merchants were not merely cogs. Many possessed formidable expertise. One reason old powers endure is that they cultivate people capable of making difficult things work. Maritime trade on such scale, urban life in such density, and architecture in such climates, all demand intelligence. The tragedy is that civilizations often reward that intelligence unequally and morally stain the conditions under which it is employed. Another feature of Calimshan's continuity is its relationship to self-description. Old powers narrate themselves incessantly. They produce chronicles, genealogies, court poetry, inscriptions, legal prefaces, origin stories, dynastic justifications, and decorative language so elaborate it sometimes seems the syllables themselves have acquired property rights. Why? Because old states know that if they do not explain themselves, others will. And others are often rude. Calimshan therefore becomes not only an old civilization, but a self-interpreting one. This is useful to historians, though one must approach such records with gloves and a sharpened sense of irony. Civilizations skilled at self-narration are also skilled at self-excuse. They can frame conquest as order, slavery as necessity, hierarchy as refinement, and ancient prestige as proof of moral worth. Still, their records are precious, precisely because they reveal what a people most needed to say about itself in order to continue. Sometimes the lie points more directly to the wound than any confession would. You may notice, too, how often Calimshan's history turns the old genie legacy from embarrassment into capital. The earliest domination by Calim could have remained solely a mark of shame. Bondage under an extraplanar tyrant, civilization born in coercion. Instead, later Kalishite culture often metabolizes that past into distinction. Elemental ancestry becomes glamour. Ancient genie works become heritage. The very antiquity of the origin becomes prestige. This is not unusual. Many peoples learn to polish the chain marks until they pass for jewelry. But polished or not, the marks remain. I do not say this to strip Calimshan of dignity. Quite the opposite. True dignity lies in surviving honest examination. A civilization that cannot withstand memory deserves none. Now we come to a matter especially relevant for future episodes: the imperial habit. Calimshan, because of its age, wealth, and urban concentration, repeatedly develops the conviction that its surrounding world exists in some degree for its arrangement. This may not always take the form of annexation. Sometimes it appears as commercial dominance, cultural superiority, dynastic intervention, patronage control, naval leverage, or simple expectation that neighbors ought to take Kalishite priorities into account, because any civilized person would do so. Such habits can be subtle at first. Then one day, you discover that the custom house is guarded by foreign troops. Your local rulers are speaking in imported titles, and your grandchildren are being told that this has always been the natural order. Empire is often only provincial inconvenience that has learned to count on a larger scale. This habit in Calimshan makes the next episode inevitable. The Shun Imperium will not be an accidental aberration. It will be old southern capacity concentrated, weaponized, and given a family name. When we arrive there, we shall see empire by habit and empire by ambition braided together. But that episode will matter more if you understand tonight that the soil was already prepared. Old ports, old wealth, old command traditions, old slavery, old dynastic thinking, old confidence that the South knew better than its neighbors. A later imperial house does not create those conditions. It inherits them. And because this season is about inheritance, Calimshan is one of its essential lessons. Let me sharpen the lesson further. To inherit Calimshan is to inherit contradictory treasures. You inherit maritime expertise and slave routes, exquisite craft and brutal stratification, old languages of rank, and the archives of those excluded from rank, palaces and harbour walls, and canals and market networks, and the labour histories embedded within them, myths of elemental splendour and the memory of elemental tyranny, and a civilization sophisticated enough to preserve itself while compromised enough to preserve too much of what should have been broken. This is why the realms never rewards easy admiration for long. It knows better. At least, the stones know better. The city above may flatter itself. The archive below is harder to charm. Before we close the drawer on this southern shelf, I want to return to one image from the beginning, the cabinet full of sand and harbour seals. It may seem a small image after genies, empires, deserts and palaces. It is not. In fact, it is the episode entire. Calimshan teaches that history survives in mixed forms, not only in monuments, in grit caught in hinges, in titles still spoken after their original contexts have vanished. In sea walls no current ruler could build from scratch, but all are delighted to claim. In marketplaces laid atop older foundations. In noble shame converted into etiquette. In roads that continue carrying wealth because old conquerors once forced the first clearing. In the expectation that a city destroyed will rise again because it always has. This is why maps lie by omission when they render such places too simply. A coloured block labelled Calimshan tells you almost nothing useful. It does not tell you that beneath the label lie centuries of coerced labour, old genie scars, forgotten dynasties, reconstructed wards, merchant pride, provincial resentment, local piety, naval calculation, inherited luxury, and neighbouring peoples who remember the realm quite differently than it remembers itself. It does not tell you that a port can be both a marvel and a wound. It does not tell you that a civilization may become so practiced at survival that even its injustices gain architectural permanence. If you want to understand Faerûn, you must learn to distrust neat surfaces, and perhaps especially the neat surfaces of old wealth. There is a certain kind of listener, often intelligent, often well-meaning, who asks after such an episode whether Calimshan is therefore bad. I understand the impulse. Moral categories feel clean, and cleanliness is a comfort in dusty archives. But the better question is harder. What does Calimshan reveal about how civilizations endure? The answer is not flattering to any age, including our own. Civilizations endure when they master logistics, memory, and self-justification. They endure when enough people need them functioning. They endure when beauty and coercion are woven tightly enough that later generations inherit both as normal. They endure when catastrophe becomes part of identity rather than an excuse for abandonment. They endure when archives, titles, roads, ports, and households keep transmitting old assumptions even after the names atop the proclamations change. Calimshan did all of this superbly. This is why it matters so much in the realms. Not because every adventurer must travel there, though many eventually do. Not because every story on the Sword Coast depends directly on Calimport, though more than one would collapse without southern trade and older precedents. It matters because Calimshan demonstrates one of Faerûn's great structural truths. The world is not shaped only by spectacular cataclysm. It is also shaped by long continuities in which power becomes ordinary. That sentence should trouble you. It troubles me. We are often most afraid of the singular horror. Curses reaching too far, gods cast down, blue fire, a city falling from the sky, a dragon in the night. Fair enough, one should fear such things. But much of history is built by smaller repetitions. A tariff collected, a slave sold, a road maintained, a court session held, a noble marriage arranged, an old title invoked, a neighborhood rebuilt on older rubble because clearing the rubble would cost more than pretending it is foundation. Calimshan is the realm of that kind of power. Not only of grand events, but of repetition so old it acquires the prestige of inevitability. And inevitability is one of tyranny's favorite perfumes. Yet here at the end, let us not deny wonder. Old Calimshan deserves wonder. To stand in Calimport at its height, to watch a harbour crowded with vessels from across the sea, to hear many tongues striking bargains beneath the same sun, to walk streets where one era rests literally above another, to see how a people made abundance visible against desert memory and catastrophe. This would be to witness a civilization of enormous vitality. Wonder is not betrayal of honesty. It becomes betrayal only when it asks honesty to leave the room. I permit wonder. I simply insist it keep its eyes open. So, as the candles burn lower and the South Gallery grows warm with trapped air and older arguments, let us ask the questions the archive prefers over applause. When a civilization survives for millennia, what exactly has survived with it? Wisdom, cruelty, technique, appetite, shame, beauty, law, or all of them braided too tightly to separate without breaking the whole? When a city is rebuilt again and again atop its own dead streets, is that resilience, refusal, denial, or some difficult combination worthy of a wiser word than we usually have? When a people inherit roads, ports, walls, titles and markets from conquerors and tyrants, at what point does use become endorsement? And at what point does survival require using what one would rather not owe? If slavery lies at the foundation of magnificence, what duties fall upon later generations who inherit the magnificence without the memory of the chains made visible beside it? When outsiders call an old civilization decadent, are they perceiving genuine moral rot, envying cultivated ease, or merely confessing that they do not understand forms of power subtler than a mailed fist? And when a realm knows it is ancient, does age teach humility, or does it too often teach the polished arrogance of those who mistake persistence for innocence? If you wish to continue through the archive between episodes, taleofthelich.com is live. There you will find the growing record, timelines, episode materials, commentary, and the accumulating shelves of this long labor against forgetfulness. The site continues to expand in an orderly manner, which distinguishes it favorably from several historical South Country palaces and at least one archive wing I inherited from a predecessor with a truly irresponsible philosophy regarding labeled drawers. Merch is coming soon as well. I continue to regard this phenomenon with the baffled reserve appropriate to one who has seen the fall of realms, yet must now contemplate the possibility of drinkware bearing reflections on slavery, seaborne taxation, and the moral instability of inherited elegance. Still, if a shirt or cup persuades one more mortal to ask what lies beneath a city's polish, perhaps commerce may occasionally be forgiven a small educational miracle. This episode was brought to you by Dharma Web Solutions. For clear, durable, maintainable web design and development, visit dharmawebsolutions.com. If you require a digital structure that can survive actual use instead of merely impressing visitors during its unveiling, choose builders who understand foundations, systems, and long-term care. Calimshan teaches what happens when infrastructure outlives ethics. Dharma Web Solutions, mercifully, appears committed to keeping both in conversation. Next time, we remain in the south, but the scale shifts from civilizational continuity to imperial habit. We will enter the Shun Imperium, where old Kalishite wealth, wizardly ambition, dynastic hunger, and the administrative confidence of a very old region harden into formal empire. There we shall see how conquest becomes routine, how decadence and competence can inhabit the same throne, and how empires often continue not because they are guided by transcendent purpose, but because powerful people become accustomed to expansion and forget how to imagine prestige without it. Study tonight's lesson well before then. Shun does not rise from sand alone. It rises from roads, ports, households, titles, old cruelties, old efficiencies, and a civilization already practiced in surviving itself. Until then, keep your candles trimmed, your accounts balanced, your admiration under discipline, and your maps annotated wherever a bright harbor has been mistaken for an innocent one. I am Irillian Cantonine. This has been the Lich's tale. And remember, ruin is not the same as forgetting. Forgetting is what happens when the living walk polished streets above buried slave quarters and call the city eternal.